Hello, everybody. Welcome. Come on in to another live stream here with us at AutoCrit. Today, I'm going to be discussing how to fix your broken characters. So you have a character in your story, you know they need to exist in your story, they serve a purpose, but they're not working. How do you fix it? We'll be discussing that. Now, if you're not familiar with AutoCrit really is the premier home for authors. We have all kinds of sections like our writer's desk, which is a online interactive workspace where you can run reports to compare yourself against best-selling authors, draft your manuscript, plan. You can do everything in there. We have an online community and we have an academy where you can learn about writing, similar to what we're going to talk about today. Again, fixing broken characters. All right, so we have people listening from all over, and it looks like a lot of you are very cold, although I do think this is very funny. South Florida, where it's a bit chilly. I'm sure. I'm sure it's so chilly down there. I'm in Central Florida, so I'm not so sure about that. Apparently in Hawaii, though, it's the low 60s, which for Hawaii, I mean, they're like breaking out the parkas. All right. So, what I would love to know from all of you here in the chat, all of you joining me live, is what are some of the things that you struggle with when it comes to your characters? And feel free to comment below as well. What are some of the things that you struggle with when it comes to your characters? And, while we're getting started, please go ahead, like if you haven't subscribed to this stream, because we have a lot of fixing coming up. We're going to be doing, people say it's like Fix It Felix, Fix It Daniel. I have all different kinds of presentations about fixing various things in your book. So you'll want to stay tuned to that. But when it comes to fixing characters, well, we want to talk about what the characters do in your story. So here's a little graph that I like to, I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller, speaking of characters. We like to divide our characters up into what I consider the core characters and the thematic characters. Now, the core characters, these are the characters that really drive the story. Without these characters, the story wouldn't really function at all. These are at the core, hence the name. So you have the protagonist, the main character, who wants something. They have a concrete goal. The antagonist is the big obstacle between them and their concrete goal. The relationship character is the character that explains to them what they need to get past that obstacle. Because if they knew already at the beginning, it wouldn't be an obstacle, right? So they help them get past the obstacle. The distraction character represents the wrong way to get past the obstacle, usually immorally, right? An immoral option to get past the obstacle. I'm loving all these comments. I'm going to get to them in just a minute. All right. So keep them coming. Keep them coming. Lots of questions coming in. All right. And then we have our thematic characters. We have characters like the support character, the sidekick who's just along for the ride. They're there to build up your main character. Then we have the opposition character. They're there to knock them down. Now, they're not, the same as the distraction character, because they're not trying to tell them the wrong way to go about things like in a moral way. They tend to just more be like, you're not good enough for this. Does this really matter? That sort of thing. Apathy, cynical, etc., etc. And then we have characters that tend to react more emotionally to whatever the worldview problem is, whatever's going on in the world that's creating a big crisis, and people that react more rationally to it. Now, I'm not suggesting that in these 8 characters, that's the only thing they do. In fact, that might be one thing that's broken about them that we will be fixing in a minute. But the first thing that I generally recommend when you have a character and they're broken in that you're getting feedback from your beta readers or your editors, and they're like, I don't even know why this character is in here. Ask yourself, do they fit any of these personalities? Do they fit any of the core personalities, or do they fit any of the thematic personalities? Because if they don't, it could be that yeah, maybe you need to merge some of their characteristics into another character. Maybe they just need to drift away. It's possible, right? Or it could be, yes, in fact, they do represent the opposition character, but you didn't turn up the temperature enough so that the audience could catch on, right? It was in your head, but didn't make it to the page, in which case you fix that. You build them up more as that, yeah, you're not good enough kind of character. And then the audience understands why they're there, right? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start looking at these comments that came in fast and furious. I love all the comments because this is a great topic here. Let's see if I can catch up. Okay, Main character is a bit boring, or sidekick is more interesting. Yes, this is a common problem that authors can have. And that is that their main character is kind of an everyday person, right? They're very relatable. They are not terribly quirky or interesting in of themselves, and then they're surrounded by these dynamic personalities that leap off the page. Sometimes this can work okay because it could be that the rest of the cast is so bananas that if you didn't have like that stable force, it would just be too crazy, kind of like Alice in Wonderland, right? But you'll notice that in something like Alice in Wonderland, or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is another example. The those sort of stories are satirical and they tend to be rather episodic in just a bunch of sequences. They're not generally the ones that are going to make people cry or get emotionally connected to the main character. So if you're trying to do that, you're going to need to fix it. You're going to need to figure out how to make your main character more interesting. One thing you can ask yourself is, did you make things too easy for your main character? In that, is your main character too well suited to the current situation? A good rule of thumb is to always ask yourself, why shouldn't the main character be doing what they're doing? My example I always like to bring up is Dancing with the Stars, right? The whole premise of that show is people who are really good at one thing are trying to do dancing, and they're not good at that, and that carries the whole thing. So you kind of want the equivalent. You want, what are they not good at, and then you make them do it, and then that tends to help a lot. Here's a good question. Let's go back to the beginning. How do you even know if a character isn't working? What makes a character not work? That is a good question, right? For the purposes of this stream, what I'm going to say is a character is not working if they are not serving the purpose that you set them out for. So it will vary, right? Some characters, you want the audience to hate them. You want them to fail. The audience is rooting for them to fail so bad, right? And that's what you want. And then there are other characters that the audience is rooting to win, right? And so if they're not behind that character and they're not rooting for them, and if they're not their biggest cheerleader, well, then that's not working, right? So that is basically the rule of thumb. Is the character doing what you intended when you put them on the page? Are they the funny kind of comic relief character? Fair enough, right? But then you might want to ask yourself sometimes, is what you're aiming for a lofty enough goal? Especially for side characters, right? Because instead of having a character that's just funny, fair enough. What if you said, I want that character to be funny, but I also want you to be concerned about them so that if something bad were to happen to them, you would be very troubled. Okay, well, then you have to make sure that that is fulfilled on the page, right? So you want to aim your goals pretty high, right? You don't want to just be like, I want somebody who's fairly interesting. No, no, no. You want somebody great. It could be that your goal for the main character is, this is the sort of character that you're going to just fall in love with so much that you would show up to Comic-Con dressed like that character. Fine, make that goal for yourself. Do it, right? Why not? Why not? You may not hit it, in which case, in some ways, it's not working. But then ask yourself, what's the difference between that character and one of those characters, right? And you'll dive deeper and you'll get stronger. Characters are so important. I really believe that characters are the most important thing when it comes to writing fiction, particularly in this modern era. You can get away with all kinds of plot problems and plot holes, and if your characters are strong, it's not true the other way around. I always focus on the story. I don't care much about the characters. Yes, I would advise to do that, like to flip that around. Perhaps that you have gotten to the point where you're really masterful at your stories. Shore up those characters. Now, it could be that you don't have to think about it. Maybe you just do this instinctively. So I don't want to criticize you too much. It could be that you don't have a lot of broken characters. In which case, give yourself a pat on the back. You're a prodigy, right? But I will say it's something that you really need to examine. Adding different types of interpersonal relationships and growth in relationships in a plausible, believable time frame. Yes, this can be challenging, right? To some degree, a lot of times as authors, we're having to ask the audience, give us some, like give us a mulligan, as it were. Like they have to just give it to us. In that it's like, whoa, they fell in love really fast. Whoa, that friendship really blossomed fast. Yeah. You try to avoid that the best you can, but there does come a point where you can just do it because you understand the purpose of the story is to dramatize something, right? So if you have a story that's about the deep rooted friendship that you can form with somebody, you don't necessarily have to actually show it in the way that it would really unfold. In real life, to get that deep rooted friendship, you probably have to be with somebody for years and years and years, if not decades, right? However, maybe you still want to demonstrate that, but just for the purposes of the story, you don't want to be like, well, they've known each other for 3 decades and then this stuff happens. Maybe it's, they just discover this person on their journey, but they just get that deep that fast. Fair enough. However, there are ways you can do that, right? There are ways. What you have to do is you have to figure out what are the things that tend to happen along the way in those decades that tend to merge you with somebody, and then force the characters into it. The other thing too is stories are often a heightened drama situation, right? It's like the old it's like the old idea of like falling in love with somebody in the middle of a crisis, right? Because it's just such a severe situation that your emotions are heightened. And I don't know if that's a very good idea. I know, was it the movie Speed? It's like relationships based on disasters never last or something like that. But it does make it more plausible, right? It's more plausible than in a situation where somebody is freaked out beyond belief. They may not think they could live to another day. At that point, they might go deeper into a relationship with somebody else. All right. It's definitely harder to grow characters when it's not being shown through their power. Interesting. It's an interesting point. All right, hold on. I have been told that because I have a younger female main character in urban fantasy that she needs to be more sassy and freak out more. I personally hate it, but would appreciate another opinion. This is sometimes I like to call this the Tiffany effect, and it's kind of an obscure example, but the idea is that when you're writing historical fantasy, you could realistically put in the name Tiffany, but because people didn't think the name Tiffany existed in like the Victorian era, they'll be like, what's this 1980s name doing there, right? The similar idea is like in the movies where they pull out the sword from the sheath and it goes shh, and obviously you would never want that because that's going to dull your sword. But if you don't do it, it looks like, oh, that's a fake sword, when that's not. So it could be that what's happening is that your readers are reading it and they read, oh, young females behave this way, which of course might tell you something about the people reading your book. Whether or not you want to lean into audience expectation, especially when it comes to stereotypes, that's your decision as an artist. I generally don't listen to such things. I'm like, yeah, that's not my character. Be gone. Now, what they could be telling you is that the character is a little bland, right? And just because somebody isn't sassy and freaking out all the time, excuse me, maybe you need to dig a little bit deeper, right? There are strong and silent types like this. What about it when the character is the strong silent type, right? Yes, you can do that, but that means you're going to have to show those little things as much as you can. It's kind of an interesting example, but I think of the sports movie Miracle, if you've ever seen that, with Kurt Russell, about the team that won in the hockey in the Olympics. Excuse me, I need to get a little drink. Sorry about that, tickle in my throat. Okay, but anyway, in that movie, the coach is very reserved and very serious, and then at the very end of the movie, after they win, he has this little moment where he just kind of celebrates, and it's so restrained and it's almost cute, it's like, oh, look at that, he's a little excited, right? But it does so much for the audience, right? Because you're like, yeah, that's the way that they would do it. So it could be that maybe you're not showing that enough. You're not showing whatever I'm not saying sassy or freaking out, but like if they seem too stoic, they may just not seem very human, right? And so you may need to lean into a little bit more of, my insides wanted to jump out, but I kept it under control, or however it is that it goes across. I love this. I'm so tired of sassy young female characters. Yeah, I agree. But, it's one of those things that once there's a trend, it's like everybody jumps on it, right? It's like the wise, saintly sort of elf that's one with nature, right? Well, that's not the only way you could write somebody that's an elf, right? They could be all kinds of things. How about an industrial elf that loves pollution? Like, come on, do something different. My bad guy is more interesting than my main characters. I'm pulling my hair here. Okay. One of the reasons why this can happen is because your main characters are not allowed to do bad things sometimes, right? And bad things tend to be interesting, especially more than good things that are boring. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is the most boring thing you can do because it could be nothing, right? You just don't respond, and that's the most moral thing to do. So if you have a main character who's very moral, they may not be terribly interesting. They may not be the life of the party. So what you do to make them more interesting is you either make them more flawed, right? But that's not the only thing you have to do. I'm not saying you don't have to make them immoral just to make them interesting, but you could make them a little bit immoral just to be more interesting or a little bit more human. But then the other thing you can do is you can just put them in situations where they get tested further, right? And so you really have to see them stand up to these things. If it seems too easy, if they're just a goody two shoes that comes in all the time and they're like, yeah, I wouldn't do that. No, I would say, like that's not going to be very compelling, right? What you need to see is somebody who's very driven towards the good and they have to fight against something, right? And I'm not saying you're not doing that, but lean more into that. Also, there are interesting things that are not related to morality whatsoever, like quirks, right? There's nothing immoral about, I don't know, liking ketchup on pancakes, although some people might disagree. If you disagree, let me know. But you know what I mean? That's just kind of weird, right? And so there are ways that you can introduce unusual things about themselves, a unique perspective on life that does not necessitate diminishing how moral they are. So you can try to look out there as well. All right. This is a good question. Aren't you supposed to have a character who fits the story? Yes, but one thing to keep in mind is a realistic character essentially exists outside of the confines of the story, much like your world does, right? Just like we talk about this when we talk about world building, right? You might know what the banking system of the fifth kingdom of whatever such and such is, but if it's not relevant to the story, who's going to bring it up, right? Why would you even know? However, the fact that you have come up with that might subtly find its way in the story, as it were. And it's the same sort of thing with your character building, right? We should have a sense that the characters had a life before and after the story, even if we don't hear about it. So that could be really helpful. All right. Just trying to catch up with the comments. I haven't even gotten to my slides yet. You're going so good with your comments this way. Anyone else getting worried? Daniel's not going to make it. It was just a tickle in my throat. It's okay. I'm just making it dramatic. See, it's a little bit of tension. That's what makes me a more interesting character, right? The quirkiness of me taking a drink. See, you can see how this works. It also gives you a little bit of excitement. You're like, I don't know. Are they going to make it? Now I'm questioning my main character. You do that. Question, question, question. All right. I just... I'm gonna catch up. All right, let's keep going then. So great. I love all these comments. Okay, empathy. One of the biggest issues with characters is creating empathy with the audience, right? The audience needs to empathize with the character. It's not necessarily the same thing as sympathy. Empathy just means they can understand where the character is coming from. It doesn't mean they actually have to relate to that and want to be that, right? This is like the villain story, right? Often we don't sympathize with the villain because the villain has some sort of heinous, immoral view, but we can at least intellectualize how they got there, right? And that can give us empathy. If it just seems like they're evil for no reason except to be evil, that generally is not very interesting. Unless the story is some sort of major archetypical good versus evil thing, which can be great. But empathizing with the main character is important, and empathizing with every character is important. If your character is annoying, well, guess what? You have an empathy problem. If the character is boring, guess what? You have an empathy problem. An example I can think of was the movie Finding Nemo. I bring up this example a lot just because it's rich with storytelling. Anyway, Marlin, the main character, is somebody who would be a very annoying character because he's just always trying to keep Nemo under his chain and he's just really restrictive and everything. And originally, when they wrote the story, you were not going to find out his tragic history, losing all of his children, until later into the story. So you would be like, oh, this is a very over attentive parent. Like, what's up? And you kind of learn in pieces what happened. Kind of similar to what happens in Finding Dory, honestly, in terms of learning that backstory in pieces. But the problem is that when they did that, you didn't have a lot of empathy for Marlin. You felt like, wow, this is kind of a jerky parent. And sure, eventually you found out why he behaved the way he did. But at that point, you're pretty far into the story, and you had to go with it that far, and it was a difficult thing to do. So keep this in mind in terms of the order of information. right? How fast do you learn what you need to learn in order to soften your view of the character could be critical in terms of how much they empathize with that character, right? Main characters, particularly, you'll find that if it's in a situation where you need to feel a lot of empathy for them, you will lean into it hard, especially if the main character is not super likable in some ways, right? Like maybe they have a very hard personality or they're not very social or things like that. It'll lean in pretty fast into why it is they are the way they are. So if they have a very dark personality because of some sort of horrible past, it's gonna lean into it quick. And this is where, backstory, obviously you don't want to start with a ton of exposition, right? But what you'll do if you want to do this appropriately is you'll make sure that you put the character in you'll put the main character in a situation where it's natural for them to bring this up. So let's say they had some sort of heinous experience that causes them essentially kind of a PTSD sort of reaction to certain things or certain triggering sort of things. You'd put them in that situation so then you can talk about it. And then it can explain, oh, that's why that person's kind of rude all the time. And isn't that sad? And I hope they get better, And you can start with a less sympathetic character in some ways that way. When should you show empathy of your character? Like, when should you try to earn empathy from the audience? Immediately. This gets to the concept of like save the cat. You probably heard of that. That's like the cheesiest way to get empathy for a character, right? Is they do something very noble and nice, like right off the bat, and immediately you're like, ah, they're so sweet. I like that person. I think they're great. And there's nothing wrong with it. I'm sounding like really cynical about it. It's effective. It's just you have to be careful because it can come across as obvious as it sounds, which is not always the best. It can come across like writer intrusion versus something natural. All right, what is their motivation? This is something you want to ask yourself of every character. Hopefully, you've been watching me, and if you haven't, go back and watch me, like and subscribe. You have been watching, and you know that you need a concrete, trackable goal. I gotta say this over and over again. It should be like monogrammed on your pill. Concrete, trackable goal, right? What motivates them? Okay, this is the main character. However, you really need to have this in general for most of your characters, right? What is it that is motivating them in general? Now, scene to scene, this is going to change too, and it should always be on the forefront of your mind. But we're talking about overall character arcs today. And yes, we need to know what is their motivation altogether. Okay? What drives them forward? Because otherwise, what you might have is a character you're just pulling the strings of as a writer. They're just going through the motion because you said, well, they have to be in this scene because they have to do such and such. And that's not the same thing as actually being motivated to be part of it, right? What's in it for them? Why are they in this? Why are they in this book? Why are they on this journey? What's going on? These are the questions you need to ask yourself, right? What is their motivation? Again, it gives them a life outside of the plot. And that's important because they do have a life outside the plot. They're a real person after all, or a real character. Another thing you need to ask yourself is, do they need what they want, right? There's a difference between needs and wants. Somebody here said, character's motivation is justice. Fair enough. I would put a trackable goal on that. How do they achieve that, right? At least for the purposes of the short term, right? It could be an overall goal that they continue on to move the goalposts once they achieve that. But for now, what would give them that satisfaction, right? That they've achieved something in that camp. But do they need what they want, right? Is what they want something that's very selfish for them and therefore they shouldn't get it? Or you hope they don't get it, or is it actually a deep rooted need that they are not going to have a fulfilling life and they're in a state of tragedy without it? And you have that option. For the main character, actually it goes many different ways. Lots of times main characters will realize over the course of a story that what they thought they needed what they thought they needed is not really what they needed and things like that. Fair enough. Side characters, that happens all the time, right? That what they think they need is not what they want. But this is something you want to ask yourself, right? Am I going to give them what they want or not? How do you communicate the needs of the wants of the side characters, or should you? Yes, you should. Absolutely. Now, you don't necessarily have to have them sit down and say, well, I want such and such. I think of the Disney movie Hercules, right, where the trainer Phil is like, I want to have my trainee in the stars, and they could say that's Phil's boy, and then at the end of the movie the guy goes, that's Phil's boy, and he achieved his want. It's very on the nose, right? You don't necessarily have to do that, but you can. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Where the main character just sits down, or I mean the side character sometimes just says, you know what, I've always wanted to run a restaurant here, maybe one day. And then at the end of the story they have a restaurant, you're like, oh look, they got what they wanted, right? But it could be that just you can infer it based on what they're constantly doing. For one thing, what somebody's constantly talking about, probably what they want, right? It's on their mind. So if they're constantly talking about being poor, probably they want something to help them raise their status so that they don't have that want anymore, right? If they're constantly talking about being lonely, well, they probably need some sort of relationship. And then what you would want, if you want a concrete trackable goal and you don't want the character to sit down and tell you that, you would clue into the audience who might fulfill that relationship need, right? And it could be friendship, love. Relationships could be anything, right? Or it could be a meaning thing. Generally I break down motivation to love, to relationship, meaning, or wealth, which is like status in society. So if it's a meaning thing, it's a question to something, well then they're going to keep asking that question. I just wish I could know what's on the other side of that mountain. I really want to know what's on the other side of the mountain. What's on the other side of the mountain? And then they find out what's on the other side of the mountain, right? Now, granted, these side characters, what they want can be very subtle, right? Or not subtle, maybe not the right word. It can be a much smaller want, a much smaller ask of the world than the main character, right? Because they're not the ones on this epic story necessarily. If you make them have this crazy growth, right? If the side character goes from the lowly farmer to the sorcerer supreme, your audience might wonder, well, why are we following the main character and not the sorcerer supreme character? Because that's kind of awesome, right? But it can happen, you can have them have epic growth, but usually no, it's a little bit smaller, right? Their aspirations are just not as high for whatever reason. Mostly because you don't want to compete with your main character. All right, paradoxes. If you find your characters a little bit flat, consider a paradox. What is a paradox? It's when somebody behaves very differently than you would expect that they would. This kind of gets back to breaking a stereotype, right? So it is the tough biker guy who also likes, I don't know, knitting pink fluffy socks, and I apologize to any biker guys who are offended by that being different than your stereotype, but this is what it's getting at, right? It's getting at the audience is not necessarily expecting that element of that character, and so bringing it up immediately makes them much more interesting because you're combining things that you don't think should match. There's all kinds of paradoxes, like can something be living and dead at the same time? Stories have dealt with this all the time with things like ghosts, which are kind of in between, and things like that. Can somebody be really loving and really hateful at the same time? Stories have examined that as well, right? So if you find that somebody has a really strong characteristic, ask yourself what would be the weirdest thing that you might throw in with that characteristic that would be completely unexpected, and just explore that, brainstorm. I'm not saying every time it's gonna hit. Sometimes it might seem contrived, but it's worth it when you're trying to fix something, right? When you have a character that's just kind of falling flat, you just don't feel it. You don't want to get rid of them, but it's just meh. You want to you want to keep them. This is a good thing to kind of stir up the imagination and perhaps get them correct. You had data like that at work, it was right and wrong at the same time. I mean, the truth of the matter is that there's so many things in life where you get these weird paradoxes, right? Where it's like it's this and it's weird, and it doesn't give a sense of realism to your story when you have that, because most of the time concepts are not just so you can't just reduce them down to quite the archetype that we're going to throw into a book, right? So getting in that little weird paradox gives it a bit of nuance that's interesting. Does a paradox need to be revealed immediately? No, it does not. You may want to hint at it, but no, it can be a huge reveal, right? Darth Vader is a great paradox, right? Not only is he this evil character who is more machine than man and all of that, he's also Luke Skywalker's father, and in a certain sense he does have a certain loyalty to his son. He seems like he might be some love going on there to some extent, whatever you want to say, however you want to describe it, certain paternal instinct, I guess, you know what I mean? But it gives a little bit of a paradox. It's also super compelling plot twist, right? So yes, paradox can be a great plot twist. In fact, actually, I would say most of the best plot twists are paradoxes. Um, Schrodinger's cat. Yes. Yes. The Schrodinger's cat is one of those concepts people just love. It just fascinates them. It is a very fascinating thing. Hell's Tailors. Make it work. I love it. That's great. All right. So the next point I wanted to bring up were internal conflicts. This is similar to a paradox, in that most of the time the character is really motivated towards something. However, there's something internally that's keeping them from not wanting it, right? So this could be something that they actually really want in life. It might be something that they need, but there's something internally that's conflicting them from getting it or from wanting to pursue it or whatever, right? Now, you got to be careful with internal conflicts for the audience, because you don't want everybody in the middle of an existential crisis, or nothing's going to get done, right? Everyone's just going to have analysis paralysis. Be like, I don't know. Should I? I'm not sure. Let's do it. But on the other hand, a little bit of internal conflict, again, gives nuance, right? You get less robotic when the character is not just like, what's my motivation? My motivation is money, 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 money. So every time money, something that could advance their wealth will come up, they'll just do it, right? Um, you kind of end up like the Seven Dwarfs or something, um, in the Disney version. But you don't necessarily want that. You want to have moments where it's like, maybe you put them in a situation where they could get the money, but then there's another thing that they would have to do, and it might be somewhat immoral, and then that'll start to conflict them. And then you've created some nuance for that character, right? Or it could be that the main character is super motivated by money, but they have had put on them this idea that greed is bad, even though they are greedy. And so they're kind of in this middle of this self-hatred, and they have to figure out a way to balance that. Is it that that original thought was overstated, that, it's okay to want to aspire to money? Or is it that they need to get over it? You can decide how it lands. But giving them that internal conflict makes them a lot more interesting. He could knit fluffy hoods for all those torture scenes. Wow. My main character wants to fit in and be popular, but she panics in crowds. That's awesome. Yes, that is a fantastic inner conflict, right? The person, it's like that old song, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world, which I never understood, because I'm like, that's terrible to be dependent on people all the time. I don't know. I don't get that at all. Maybe you could explain. Tell me in the comments if that makes sense to you. I think that sounds awful. But essentially, people who need other people, but then are also scared by other people, are kind of miserable, right? Because what they need is also what harms them, and it's this terrible dance that they have to do all the time. And that's immediately compelling. That's drama for you, right? That's drama, kids, and that's what you want. That's what you want to have more of in your story. My main character wants to show off her powers, but she's afraid of being killed if she does. That's a great internal conflict, right? They would love the notoriety of being able to show off what they can do, but the consequences are too severe. So maybe it's societal consequences because people aren't supposed to have those powers or something like that. That's a great internal conflict, right? Although it's based on an external conflict of the world, but they still have to internally fight their desire to do it, right? And so you're taking the external and putting it internal, which is a great thing to do, versus just some external thing that doesn't go anywhere. All right. All right. When it comes to characters that are likable or interesting or compelling, these are three words that you should remember: funny, competent, driven. If you got one of these three, you're in good shape. If you have all three, you have a very compelling person, right? Because we like people who make us laugh. We like people, even if it's dark humor, because what that shows is that find, they can kind of abstract out of this abyss something to laugh at, and that's very noble in a way. Sort of, it's a coping mechanism that helps us cope with it too. So we like that. Competency. Competency is something we really admire, right? And it doesn't matter what you're competent in. You could be the best whatever blizzard maker at Dairy Queen, and if you do a really fantastic job and you put up a video on like TikTok and it's like this person could do 30 blizzards in 10 seconds or whatever, and you're like, whoa, you're very interested in that person, right? Because and I've been thinking about it a while. Like, why is this the case? And the best thing I can think of, I'm not like a psychologist, is that I think that we are very motivated to figure out what we are good at, and become the best at it, and to have that kind of competency ourselves. When somebody else does it, we are a little bit envious, but we're mostly motivated by it, right? Because what it tells us is there could be something out there that we are that good at, and we just need to find it, right? And that person did, and isn't it awesome? And we just find that very motivating because we know there's got to be something out there for us, right? Because we're human too. That's kind of my thought, right? It's a bit of wish fulfillment. So competency is something that people that could be really good. This could be particularly helpful if the character is not likable, right? So there's somebody that's evil. An competent evil person is often much more interesting than a stupid evil person, right? And I don't mean like not wise. That's different. That's not quite competency. I'm talking about like, somebody could be very unwise and that ultimately they're going to lead to their own self-destruction, but they're really good at creating that destruction in the meantime, right? And they're so good at it that you don't even know how you're going to get past them. That's a compelling character, right? So you could have one of them, although they would also be driven as well, right? So you'll have competency and drift. Usually you'll have two of the three, but all three, again, that's going to be quite a compelling character. And then being driven, it kind of goes to competency, right? Because competency doesn't just usually fall on your head. Now, there are characters like that. We're never really told like how Sherlock Holmes became all that competent. I don't think. Somebody's going to correct me in the comments. Go ahead and correct me in the comments. I don't remember it being like he had like an insane amount of training exactly so much. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't imply he didn't work at it at all, but the general gist you get from that sort of character is that he was like born that way, right? He was just born a genius, right? So his competency was in place. But in terms of the drivenness of it, he's very driven to use that in order to solve crimes and to get something done, right? So, but it does usually come with competency. Often the people are very driven, which is also making them competent as well. Now, in terms of driven, that means during the story, they are moving things forward, right? They want to get things done. We generally like people who want to get things done. We will follow a compelling person who's very driven into a burning building because they're like, wow, that person really wants to go places. I don't know. Just check out social media and you can see what I mean, right? And fill in your blank with who comes to mind with that. But we are often quite motivated by such. And so this is, again, a way to make a compelling, motivating character. Make them funny, make them competent, make them driven. Batman comes to mind when you say driven and competent. Yes, and I wouldn't say Batman is particularly well known for being funny unless you want to talk about like the Adam West version. But generally, no, he's not particularly funny, right? I would say, though, the Joker is all three, right? So that's one reason that character is quite compelling. A brilliant, arrogant surgeon who saves many lives. Yes, like Doctor Strange, who is funny, competent, and driven. Look at that. And also a jerk. But he ends up having to overcome that, right? And now that gets to competency, actually. So competency in the main character or in any character doesn't mean what the story is acting them to do. What the story is asking them to do is what they're competent at. In fact, it should not be, right? They're very competent at something or many things, but they are not competent at what the story is asking them to do as much as possible, because that's what's going to create your tension. This is an example I give sometimes with Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, right? You would think that the main thing that the story would have her do is not be competent at survival. But actually, she's very competent at survival, which to some degree makes it more realistic when somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of training ends up thrust into that situation, because just life itself trained her for that situation, right? But what she's not competent at is playing to the cameras, and that's what she has to do a whole lot. right? And so that's what makes that's what helps make the compelling story. Peter Sellers in the Pink Panther is funny, incompetent, and driven. Right. I would say Dory in Finding Nemo is kind of like that, funny and not particularly competent, but very driven. Right. Just keep swimming. Very funny. However, the one thing is she is very competent at least at explaining to Marlin how he has to behave with Nemo. So in that way, she's competent, but in many ways, she's completely incompetent. Right. But that actually is a very good point. If you want to make an incompetent character who's very kind of stupid, you know, uh, focus on the other two. You'll notice Merry and Pippin in Lord of the Rings, pretty funny, also pretty driven. Like they're just kind of running off and doing stuff, not very competent. So you got two of the three. Two of the three is okay. One of the three is at the very least something you need. If you don't have, if your character is not funny, they're incompetent and they're lax, you just don't have any. There's very little that you can latch on to. I'm not sure if I can think of any character that doesn't fit all that doesn't fit any of them that is really that compelling of a character, right? It might be a sort of a side like one moment character. Certainly not anything anyone's going to dress up for at Comic Con or anything like that, unless they're doing it ironically. Subplots and timing. One thing to keep in mind with all of your characters is they give you the opportunity to have subplots, other things going on in the world besides what the main character is working on. Again, this can give realism. It can also give you more of a sense of the world itself. It can also give you some great timing opportunities. So people jump in at the right time and plots get resolved at a different time. Resolving plots throughout your story is a great way to reward the audience and let them know that the reward for the big plot is coming and it's going to be awesome in the meantime. Okay, I think we're good. I have some other slides here. Hold on. I got to go to what I was looking at. That's what I was looking for. Fixing broken scenes. Talking about fixing broken things. Fixing broken scenes workshop. Yes. This Thursday, I will be doing my Fixing Broken Scenes workshop. Some of you have joined me for the Fixing Broken Dialogue workshop. Hello. It was fun, wasn't it? Yeah, we talked about dialogue. On Thursday, I'm going to be doing my Fixing Broken Scenes workshop. Please join us for that. And if you want to sign up for it, I can go ahead and throw that link in the chat. The nice thing about the workshop is unlike something like this, where I'm just kind of talking to you and I can go back and forth in the chat, we actually do real exercises in the workshops. So we do real-time exercises. I get feedback from everybody, and then we go back and forth. It's really fun. And you can learn a lot in real time. And then at the end of the workshop, you'll have the opportunity to submit something to me, get personalized feedback back to you, and learn from the workshop that way. So yes, I went ahead and threw that in the link there. I can also throw it here on the screen. It's a little bit of a long URL, so feel free to check it out on in the chat as well. Get autocrit.com/products/fixing-broken-scenes.workshop. And yeah, you can join me this weekend. There's going to be a session on Thursday in the afternoon, Sunday at night. It's going to be the same deck of slides, although anybody who knows me knows I don't work off of scripts. Yeah. And it will be a little bit different, but also the feedback, of course, will be different depending on who shows up. So. All right. Now, Thursday, well, actually, I'm jumping ahead. Tonight, for pro members of AutoCrit, we do have a fantasy club. I'm going to be discussing fairy tales, how to be inspired by fairy tales, classic fairy tales. I recommend joining even if you don't write fantasy, because fairy tales are just such a classic type of literature, and there's a lot you can learn from them no matter what you're writing. And then tomorrow for the horror club, we have Richard Oakes and Adam Leader. And they will be joining Gareth, our horror expert, in the horror club. Again, both of those are anybody who's a pro member eligible to join us for that. On Friday at 1 o'clock, we will have our Including Holidays in Stories workshop, where I will be discussing how to incorporate holidays into your story, whether real or fictitious. We'll talk about real and we'll talk about fictitious. What time fairy tales? 7 p.m. Eastern this evening. And in order to find all of these, I recommend going to the dashboard, which is, or the hub at AutoCrit.com. The main page, and you just go to the community events there on the right, or you can click calendar at the top of the page and you can RSVP, sign up for all of those events. So please join me. If you're not an AutoCrit member, now's a good time to join. Please do so. And then you can go ahead to autocrit.com. I can't wait till I can afford to be a pro member. I was hoping to get it, but it's tomorrow already. Well, I'll see you next week. But yes, please join us. Become a pro member as soon as you can. Oh no, you're going to be at your daughter's recital. Well, don't worry. If this sort of thing happens, you can always catch the replays, right? So you catch the replays, you can go into the calendar, and you can go to past events. I know it's not as much fun as being there in person. And if you want to submit any questions in advance, just go into the AutoCrit community and post your questions in there. So please go ahead and do that. And then it's like you're there sort of by proxy. Anyway, in the meantime, I will see you around this channel. We have more live streams coming up. Please, like I said, like, subscribe, hit the bell so you get reminded. And I will see you next week at 1 o'clock. I know I won't get your charming banter. I'm sorry, Jim. It's a shame. But you'll get to see mine just in replay. So there we go. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much. You have a great week.